say Viking. And what is the first image that comes to mind? Brutal men leaping off dragon-headed ships and slaughtering helpless people by the dozen in all directions, burning, looting, raping every woman who still had a pulse, and maybe even some who didn't, laughing at their own savagery. Rejoicing in unrestricted bloodletting simply for its own sake. Or to put it simply, well, they weren't really very nice. Yeah. That is the popular view of the Vikings. Savagery beyond anything committed by anybody else. Unsatiable bloodlust. Men who did nothing but raid, plunder, and kill 24/7, 365 days a year. Yes, that is what you probably were told in school. And it would be the theme in many documentaries, in movies, and history books. But is it really correct? Is that the true picture of the Vikings? Well, in a nutshell, no. No, it isn't. It is really on the par with George Washington chopping down that famous cherry tree, with the Emperor Nero fiddling away as Rome burned, Lord Nelson putting the telescope to his blind eye at Copenhagen and saying, "What signal? I see no signal," and Paul Revere shouting, "The British are coming!" Yes, you see, with a very romantic, and everybody knows those stories. See, the problem, though, with them is that George never whacked a tree. Violins weren't invented in Roman times. And anyway, Nero was actually busy in the streets of Rome helping to fight the fire, having rushed back to Rome from his country villa as soon as he heard of it. Lord Nelson, he wasn't blind in one eye, and he never actually wore an eye patch. And it was actually a young woman who rode shouting about the British coming. Paul Revere himself never opened his mouth during that ride, except once to answer a woman who asked him where he was going. So much for popular history. Aspects of the Viking image. Yes, if aspects of it may be partially correct, but often taken out of context, and the reasons for them ignored, as well as the age they lived in, and comparisons with other people living at the same time, as well as before and since their time. So having said all that, the answer to the question remains the same. No. It isn't a true picture of the Vikings, or more correctly, the Old Norse, because you were only a Viking or a Vikinger when you got in a ship and went somewhere, be it trading, raiding, or founding settlements, or scratching your arse as you admired the scenery. If you didn't get into a ship, you weren't a Viking. So it is only that specific group of Norse people who did get into ships and do things that we're actually talking about. Now, that's not to say that those unfortunate people whose villages, towns, and monastic establishments were raided did not experience horrific events, that nobody was brutalized or killed or women raped. Of course they were, but that was part and parcel of raiding, regardless of who was doing the raiding. There was no such thing as a nice, polite, gentlemanly raid between good friends, people you just drop in on as you happen to be sailing past their coastal town. I say, Anglo-Saxon person, would you mind if I took all the valuables you have and I raped a few of your women? You wouldn't object? Oh, thank you so much. You are a very friendly victim. We'll be back next year because it is a real pleasure to raid you. No. That didn't happen. All raids were violent, though the degree of violence could vary. And the true picture would be that the Vikings were often hardly any worse than others. But, you see, they did it better. They had more style, you might say, more panache. They were more booyah about the whole thing. And they had those lovely ships with dragon heads on them. Nobody else had those. And they often quite deliberately played up the ferocity of their raids for its effect. Terrified people are far less likely to resist and more inclined to simply run away, which is a great help to those who are doing the raiding. It benefits the raiders and it benefits the raidees, because the less people are still there when the raiders turn up, well, the less people are potentially going to get killed. It is often seemingly suggested that peace and tranquility and love and bliss existed in Europe prior to 793 AD, when the first Viking raid occurred outside Scandinavia itself. And that brought an end to the love and the joy and the peace and the butterflies fluttering around. When the monastic settlement on the island of Lindisfarne, or Lindisfarne as it is today, in the kingdom of Northumbria, was looted and destroyed, sending shockwaves throughout the entirety of Anglo-Saxon Britain, a raid unlike any other that had ever occurred in Britain. But you see, that is actually very far from the truth. Yes, it was the first time a major Christian holy place had been destroyed. I mean, that was true enough, and that was the thing that was so shocking to the Anglo-Saxons. This was an attack on God, which I'll come to in a minute. But it was far from being the first incursion into Britain by foreign raiders. Oh, not by a very long way. In fact, at no time in the history of the British Isles had there ever been a totally raid-free period, or a period of non-violence. You see, the ancient Britons, the original inhabitants of the British Isles, which is why they were called Britons, had squabbled and fought each other constantly. The various tribes were raiding other tribes' territories. One tribe would capture land or goods or women, which the other tribe would then try to get back, and they would go and raid the raiders and take their stuff back, and then the raiders would raid them, and it just kept going. After the Roman conquest of Britain, yes, Britain had been largely peaceful, on and off, for centuries, enjoying the Pax Romana, peace and stability provided by the Roman legions on land and by the Classis Britannica at sea, which meant the fleet of Britain, the Roman provincial navy, which was based at what is Boulogne today. And it was charged with patrolling the Oceanus Britannicus and the Oceanus Germanicus, or the English Channel and the North Sea, as we call them, as well as the coast and river systems of Britain and the continental coast as far up as the Rhine estuary. But even then, foreign raiders were not uncommon. The Picts would come down from the far north, eventually forcing the Emperor Hadrian to build his famous wall to try and keep them out. Various Germanic peoples would come across the North Sea from northern Europe and raid the east coast, while the Celtic Irish, well, they would strike the west coast. Given the presence of the might of Rome, of course, those raids were usually little more than a minor annoyance. They would run in, grab something, and go again. They certainly were not going to tangle with the Roman legion, nor with the Roman war galleys. But the raids would have been quite brutal to those who experienced them, small and localized though they might be. But by the first decade of the 5th century, the Roman Empire had all but collapsed. There was no longer a powerful military presence in Britain. The legions were gone, the Classis Britannica long since disbanded. And the various German tribes from northern Europe took great advantage of that. They could land at will, anywhere along the coast, anywhere they chose. The Anglo-Saxons, the Jutes, the Frisians, all crossed the sea, and not just to raid. This time they didn't want to collect goods or women and take them home. No, they wanted land, they wanted conquest, they wanted to occupy the country. They brutally drove the Britons westwards into Wales and Cornwall, and they would become the new owners of the land. And we know them today as the Anglo-Saxons, who would eventually divide the land into the kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, as well as various little local rulers who popped up here and there from time to time. But, this Anglo-Saxon Britain was itself far from peaceful, nor was it free from raiding. Raiding was going on all over the place. Everybody was raiding everybody else. Various kings and petty chiefs squabbling over land and raiding each other's territories, just as before. To add to that, raids by foreigners were frequent. Celtic tribesmen from Wales, seeing themselves as the true owners of the land, which, to be honest, of course, they actually were, they would descend on Mercia to steal livestock and women. from the kingdom of Alba, or Scotland as we know it. Warriors would come across the now unguarded Roman wall and raid into Northumbria. And the Celtic Irish would also raid along the west coast of Britain. In fact, that's how Ireland later got St. Patrick as one of its patron saints, since he was a Romano-British man abducted by Irish raiders. So raids were a pretty common thing at that time. They always had been, which is something that is often overlooked. It's implied that brutal raids from overseas was something absolutely new in the Anglo-Saxon era. It had never happened before, whereas in fact the Vikings were just the last group to arrive. They were the Johnny-come-latelys, if you like, of the raiders. But they were different, and that was what made them stand out. Their raids tended to specifically target religious establishments, churches, monasteries, nunneries, and the like, undefended places where wealth could be easily obtained. And that, along with their pagan beliefs, it made them more fearsome and more detested by the devoutly Christian Anglo-Saxons than would otherwise have been the case. They were not seen just as mere raiders. I mean, that wouldn't have surprised anybody at the time. What? Oh, the Vikings are raiding. Oh, right. Oh, it's them this week. Yeah, it was the Picts last week, and it was those paddies from Ireland the week before that. No, I mean, people wouldn't have taken any great notice of them, but the Vikings came to be seen as the minions of Satan, men in league with the devil and trying to destroy the true faith of Christ. Simply being pagans would have made them totally evil. Even if they had arrived bringing gifts and spreading love and peace all around, petting children and rubbing kittens, it would have made no difference. They were evil pagans. The Anglo-Saxons, the Celtic Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, they were all Christians, and very devout Christians. So in their infighting and raiding each other's lands, they had always stayed away from church property, fearing, of course, the everlasting fires of hell. But the Viking raiders, they had no fear of the Christian nailed God. To them, a weak and ineffectual God who wanted people to turn the other cheek, forgive their enemies. Oh, I mean, he seemed a very poor deity compared with Odin or Thor. Can you imagine Odin turning his cheek and letting you hit him again? No, not really likely. So the Vikings had no fear of the church or its property, and that was where the wealth of the day was to be found. Many bishops were wealthier than the kings or thanes they served. Churches and monasteries were filled with gold and silver objects, bejeweled vestments, and offerings of money, since a hefty donation to the church was seen as buying a front seat in heaven. The more money you gave, the better seat you got in the hereafter. And thus churches and monasteries contained far better plunder than most of the king's palaces would have. Alfred the Great's palace in Winchester would have had far less worth taking in it than the Archbishop's palace nearby. So that was where the Vikings went. It made sense. Why attack a fishing village or a small town with little to be gained when there was a monastery or a church nearby filled with treasure, easy for the taking? But as I said, the Vikings were pagan, and that fact, plus who the people were who wrote about their raids, was more responsible for their bloodthirsty image in history than the actual violence of their attacks, which was often no worse than what had gone before or indeed would come after. Few people were literate in the 8th and 9th centuries, or indeed for most of the Middle Ages afterwards. Many kings and nobles were only semi-literate, and it was the priests and the monks who were the scholars of the age. They were able to read and write, and they were employed as scribes by the nobility. No great noble or king was going to sit down and write his own letter. Even if he could, he'd dictate it to his priest or monk scribe. It was they who wrote the history. The famous works like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Annals of the Four Masters, or the Annals of Ulster were written down in monasteries by priests and monks. Coincidentally, the same buildings and the same people who were the most frequent targets of the Viking raiders. I think you see where that was going. Raiders who would not have been seen by the clergy just as normal men out for easy plunder, but as agents of Satan, the evil spawn of the devil, and their attacks on churches not as the sensible choice of the best places to raid, but as deliberate attacks against the house of God, an attempt to wipe the true faith from the face of the earth and replace it with evil, pagan idolatry. Oh, the evil of it was so beyond anything that one could conceive. Yeah. So their accounts of the Vikings were greatly, coloured by their own attitudes towards them from a religious viewpoint. In truth, most Vikings would have had no interest in what the Christians believed, any more than they did when they encountered Muslims or Jews in Spain, the Middle East, or North Africa. Now, yeah, some Vikings would have disliked Christianity. Obviously, there are bigots in all religions, but for the most part, they had no particular dislike for Christians simply for being Christians. And early missionaries to Scandinavia or to Iceland, well, they were generally either well treated or simply ignored. They were not tortured or killed, as, pagans who hated every Christian, as we are told the Vikings would have done. Dislike of Christians would often have come from the intolerant and brutal way that the Christians themselves treated pagans, rather than any actual religious feelings. Attempts at forced conversion or trade discrimination against pagans will often result in an axe several inches inside somebody's skull, and one can see why. See, Christians were forbidden by the church to trade with pagans. That was a terrible, terrible sin. And given the huge extent of Norse trading across Europe and the Middle East, that alone would have been a considerable flashpoint between the two cultures. Of course, many Christians simply ignored the church's edicts and they traded anyway, as did the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. But the often brutal treatment of pagans by the church, trying to convert them, trying to show them the love, the joy, the kindness, the decency of the teachings of Jesus by burning them at the stake or pulling their heads off if they didn't accept it, that could lead to, certain resentment, I think, on the part of the pagans. So, how genuinely brutal were the Vikings? It was a brutal age. The Anglo-Saxons were not averse to massacres themselves when it suited them, nor was anyone else in Europe or the Middle East, for that matter. Centuries previously, civilizations had existed that were brutal beyond anything the Vikings ever did. The Assyrian Empire, for example, or the legions of Rome, who were excessively brutal, though it was a very precise, controlled military brutality for a specific reason, the legions simply killing everything in front of them, human or animal, until an officer told them to stop. Julius Caesar, though, usually a very compassionate man and famous for his often considerable kindness to vanquishing foes, arranging for food on one occasion for a tribe who he turned back because he didn't want them to starve when he drove them back to where they had come from. But he once slaughtered 40,000 people in Gaul as punishment for rising up against Rome and a warning to others not to follow suit, which certainly made sense when you think about it. And later the Roman legions killed over 50,000 in retribution for similar happenings in Germania. Brutality after the Viking Age, also, it often surpassed anything the Norsemen had done, being frequently a brutality without even the justification of frightening people into running away, a brutality that was brutal simply for its own sake, and often religiously motivated, which the Vikings were not. The Crusaders, the Inquisition, the religious wars of the 16th century, the conquistadors, the persecution of the Jews, and so on. Viking raiders never put people into Iron Maidens, tore them apart on the rack, or burned them at the stake for their religious beliefs. They simply killed anyone who got in their way. You didn't want to be killed and just give them what they wanted or run away and let them take it. They wouldn't follow you and torture you just for the fun of it, nor for believing in a different god. The church would, and did, frequently. One aspect of Viking raids that set them apart was their speed, and the fact that it usually came from the sea, making defence or subsequent pursuit near to impossible. A force on land, however quickly they might move, well, they would have their approach seen. Towns ahead would be getting warning of their impending attack, and the raiders might then be pursued by the local thane or king. But ships suddenly appearing out of nowhere, suddenly there's a sail on the horizon, and then moments later they run up onto the beach and they disgorge their warriors. there would be little or no warning of the attack, and a pursuit was impossible, since the Viking ships would be disappearing over the horizon before any resistance could be organized. And as far as pursuit, well, who's going to have a ship handy that's capable of catching a longship? That added a frightening new aspect to the Viking raids, and the shallow draft of their longships. They were able to sail up any river more than 3 feet deep, meant they could strike deep inland far more quickly than could any land-based raiding party. And their violence was often very carefully contrived to produce the maximum effect. The phrase, "God protect us from the fury of the Northmen," was the result of a very well thought-out policy. Terrified people don't fight. They run or they surrender, and that way you get what you want with fewer casualties. On both sides, of course, since people who are no longer in a village or somewhere when it's attacked, well, they're very unlikely to be killed if they're not there to be killed. Makes sense if you think about it. You know, they would decimate a village or a small town, slaughter everyone who wouldn't make a good slave, and burn the place. So word of that would spread. You see, word would spread down the coast, so that the next town they came to would probably offer no resistance, if indeed anybody was still there and hadn't run for the hills the moment the longships were seen approaching. Panic was worth a lot of warriors. But they were just as happy to get what they wanted peacefully, if that was possible, as is shown by the Danegeld, the payments that the Anglo-Saxons started making to them to get them to go away, which they were perfectly happy to do. Here's a big chest full of hack silver. Oh, wonderful, we don't have to fight, thank you very much. And off they go. Of course, the one big problem about Danegeld, I mean, the idea was fine, give them money, they'll go away, but the major downside of it was it didn't work. Because, of course, the Vikings simply came back for more. Danegeld being perhaps one of history's most stupid ideas, since instead of getting rid of the Vikings as it was supposed to do, it just brought them back again and again and again to get more. Though admittedly, of course, it did prevent bloodshed. There's a monument in Scandinavia erected by one Viking leader commemorating his 3rd trip to England to collect Danegeld, which is very nice for him, since he probably got even more than he would have from a raid, and at no cost to himself in casualties. I'm sure the Norsemen must have thought the Anglo-Saxons were pretty stupid for coming up with that idea, which was the best way of ensuring that the raiders did not go away. It would be like a bank offering bags of money to bank robbers not to rob the bank. You know, they're going to come back tomorrow for another bag. An unfortunate aspect of the Viking raids is that so many people see them as just that, raiders, men who were possibly too lazy to work for themselves and preferred to simply steal the honest fruits of the labor of others, men who did nothing but sail around in dragon-headed ships, looting, killing and raping all day long. As I said at the start, raiding 24/7, 365 days a year, all they did. Of course, that is just so laughable. You know, it is ridiculous. And it's about as true as the horned helmets they were supposed to wear, but never actually did. You know, few men would have been nothing but raiders, living entirely from the proceeds of their weapons. The majority would have been merely part-time raiders, being farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, when they were at home. There were many tasks to be done, especially in an agricultural society, which the old Norse society was. It was agricultural. Farming and fishing were the principal livelihood, not going off raiding. That involved ploughing and planting crops and harvesting them, which couldn't be done by somebody who was hundreds of miles away in a fancy boat with a dragon's head on the front. You know, plus the fact that raiding or trading expeditions would usually be carried out in the summer, when the sea conditions would be at their best. The North Sea is a very stormy place during the winter. It's not somewhere you want to be in a small boat. And while the longships were superbly designed for seagoing conditions, only a complete fool would deliberately sail out into the winter storms for no good reason, when he could simply wait for the summer when the sea would be nice and flat. You know, and who was doing the metalwork, forging various things of iron, constructing and manufacturing buildings, if the blacksmiths and the craftsmen were all floating around somewhere in a boat? You know, people don't think of that. Somebody had to stay home. The only times when the Norse would have remained away for long periods, or perhaps not even returned to Scandinavia at all, would have been times such as when the great heathen army landed in England, intent on conquest and gaining land for their own use, not on simply obtaining goods and then leaving again, or when they founded settlements abroad, as they did so often here in Ireland and of course in Iceland and in Greenland. But that wasn't raiding. No, I mean, that was settlement, it was colonization, which is a different thing altogether. When entire families would go, not just warriors, and bringing livestock and building materials with them. But raiding was a short-term activity, generally confined to the summer months and involving a relatively small number of men. The majority of Norse men would never have gone raiding, or maybe only done it very occasionally. Trading would actually have taken up more time and more men than raiding, and women too sometimes, since we know women acted as merchants. And the trading aspect of the Old Norse is so often overlooked by those who simply see them as church-burning, women-raping savages. The extent of trading is well illustrated by the goods that are found in graves across Scandinavia. I mean, there's great hordes of Arab coins from the Middle East, for example, over 200,000 of them. Items from Baghdad, Afghanistan, and as far as India are frequently found in grave sites. So we can clearly see that trade was every bit as important to the Norse as raiding, sometimes even more so, since they would have not been able to mount military expeditions to many of the places they traded with, given the distances and the resistance they would have encountered. The crews of a few longships would not have been able to fight their way to Baghdad or across to India against the huge armies that they would have encountered. They took exotic furs, beautiful metalwork, and amber. And amber is common in northern latitudes, but it's rare in the Mediterranean. And they exchanged it for silver or goods not available in their own lands. And, of course, slaves. Now, slaves were an important and valuable commodity. They fetched good prices in the markets of Francia and Constantinople. And Dyflin, or Dublin as it is today, under Norse rule became one of the most important slave trading centres in Western Europe, with men like the famous Ivar the Boneless and Olafur the White making considerable profits from it. So, were the Vikings the most brutal people of their age? No, they were pretty much average as far as brutality went. They merely did it with more style. They put more thought into it, you might say, and they made it more effective. But the brutality itself, the methods of killing they employed, for example, were a little different to anyone else of their day, with the exception of their initial use of the axe as a combat weapon rather than a domestic tool, developing it into specialized types ideal for combat, such as the bearded axe, which had a long, curved blade which could be hooked over an enemy's shield and used to pull it down, or the famous Dane axe, a large and heavy axe head mounted on a 4-foot-long wooden pole that gave it tremendous force. It was able to cleave a man in two right down through his chest. We see a great example of the Dane axe, of course, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, when a Viking armed with one was able to hold off the entire Anglo-Saxon army as they tried to cross the bridge, killing 40 of them in the process because, well, nobody could get near him swinging the Dane axe. The Vikings were really the first to develop the axe into a weapon as well as a tool, though others then followed their example, and eventually the battle axe became a standard weapon of the Middle Ages. But its initial use by Viking raiders did a great deal to establish their reputation as fierce, unstoppable warriors, such as the incident at Stamford Bridge. Other weapons employed by the Vikings were simply the standard ones of their time: spears, bows, knives, swords. Those swords, now swords were used more by the most important warriors, by jarls and kings, as well as the professional household troops of the nobility, the housecarls, because swords were quite expensive, and they would have been beyond the means of the average man. The average man would have carried a spear and an axe, probably the same axe he would use for domestic carpentry purposes, since, well, any axe will smash somebody's skull in quite effectively. And again, the special war axes would have been more expensive and probably used mainly by the important warriors and the household troops. Of course, any man might obtain an expensive weapon if he took it from a dead enemy, so even the most humble farmer or carpenter, or he might have acquired a very expensive and highly decorated sword. Though I suppose such a man would have been very unlikely to be facing up to a warrior who would have been so armed, and probably a far superior fighter, unless of course he snuck up on him from behind. So, to sum up, the Vikings were no more brutal or violent than many other people of their day, or before or after them, and the methods of killing they employed were simply the standard ones of their day, using the same weapons as everybody else. They did not use torture as a weapon of control, as did the church. Things like the rack, the Iron Maiden, or flaying, which was slowly pulling somebody's skin off. And that's quite sore. Yeah, very, very sore. They were not part of their military strategy. They did not massacre entire cities simply for the sake of doing so, as the oh-so-noble Crusaders did in Jerusalem, for example, turning that city into a blood lake, or as the armies of Tamerlane or Genghis Khan did, slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people at a time, rather frequently, and for no good reason other than to induce terror, basically simply because they could, which was a pretty good reason as far as they were concerned. They did not kill for religious reasons, slaughtering those who did not follow their gods, as many others did. And their often suggested hatred of Christianity due to their attacks on churches and other religious buildings had more to do with sensible targeting of the most profitable locations than it had to do with religion, though the monks who wrote about it, of course, tried to make it seem that hatred of the true faith was entirely responsible. And if all the wealth of the day had been in the hands of Jews and Muslims, well, the Vikings would have ignored Christian buildings. They'd have walked right past the local church, ignored it altogether, and they would have raided synagogues and mosques. And today, we would be saying, equally wrong, that they hated Judaism and Islam, and they were trying to wipe those faiths from the face of the earth. The Vikings got what we would call a bad press, and that has influenced our view of them even today. Though of recent years, more and more historians are showing the true facts of the Viking Age rather than the biased and very slanted suppositions of the past. As Napoleon said regarding warfare, history is written by the victors. But it could also be said that sometimes it is written by the victims. And in both cases, it often becomes a matter of everything we did was good and pure and noble, and we did it for the betterment of our fellow man, but everything they did was vile and evil, absolutely evilly driven. They were so evil, when actually both were exactly the same thing. So it has often been with the Vikings. The greatest traders, explorers, settlers, founders of new towns of their age, even founding countries, what would later become Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine, as well as Normandy, for example, often intermarrying with those they settled among, converting to the religion of those others. A thing that set them apart from the later colonials of the 18th and 19th century, who wouldn't have dreamed of doing that with the mere natives who they conquered. Oh, good heavens! I mean, one couldn't do that, could one? And of course, the Vikings also developed incredible navigational skills, shipbuilding that surpassed anything that had gone before or came after them for centuries. Yet they are almost always remembered for raiding and savage brutality. A part of what they were, yes, but only a part, and something that was also a part of, well, everyone else at that time to greater or lesser extent. If you enjoyed this video, well, please like, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and a share would be appreciated. Spread the word. Tell your friends. Let the world go forth. Let it spread across the world. Or, well, yeah, just tell somebody you know. So until next time, I shall say farewell. Goodbye for now,